Jacob Harrison thought he had won at life, a self-made millionaire, a dream wedding to a stunning bride, and a future that screamed power and perfection. He had invited his ex, Emily, just to prove how far he had come, to watch her witness his success from the sidelines. But what he didn't know, she wasn't coming alone. And when she walked in, holding hands with two identical little boys, the entire room went silent, the ultimate plot twist. Jacob wasn't just a groom, he was a father, and he never even knew. The whispers spread like wildfire. His fiancée, Victoria, stood frozen, her perfect world crumbling in front of hundreds of guests. The wedding of the year had just turned into a full-blown scandal, and Jacob was at the center of it all. How had this happened? How had the man who controlled everything lost control of the biggest secret of his life? Emily wasn't there to ruin his wedding. She was there to reveal the truth, and as Jacob faced the consequences of his past, one question remained: would he run from his mistakes or finally face them? Jacob Harrison wasn't born into success. He clawed his way out of a life that seemed destined for failure, growing up in a forgotten corner of the city where dreams were luxuries no one could afford. He knew that if he wanted to escape, he couldn't just work hard. He had to be ruthless. While other kids played, he was hustling, flipping whatever he could for profit, planning his escape. When he landed a full-ride scholarship, it was his golden ticket. College wasn't about making friends or having fun. It was war, while his classmates partied. Jacob spent sleepless nights coding, planning, obsessing, and when the chance came to pitch his startup idea to investors, he didn't hesitate. Failure wasn't an option. He charmed, negotiated, and outsmarted everyone in the room. The company took off, and Jacob became the unstoppable force he had always dreamed of being. Money, status, power, it all came fast, but success is a hungry beast, and it demanded his full attention. Every second was a calculated move, relationships, distractions, love. A liability. He convinced himself that he was too busy to care. And yet, in the midst of all this chaos, there was Emily, the one person who had been there from the beginning. She had seen the best and worst of him, had supported him when he had nothing, but as his world expanded, she became smaller in it. The deeper he dove into his empire, the more she faded into the background, until one day she was gone. At the time, it didn't matter. He told himself that love was just a distraction from the bigger picture. And the bigger picture, it was magnificent. He had everything, or so he thought. Because fate has a way of making even the most powerful men realize one truth. You can run from the past, but it always catches up. Years later, standing at the top of his empire, Jacob made a bold move. He sent an invitation to Emily. Not because he missed her, not because he cared, but because he wanted to see what she had become without him. Maybe she would feel regret. Maybe she would see what she had lost. He had no idea that the person about to walk through those wedding doors would be the one to turn his world upside down. Emily Carter had never been interested in money or power. She believed in dreams, in passion, in the kind of love that could weather any storm. And when she met Jacob, she saw something in him that no one else did. Potential. He wasn't just ambitious, he was relentless, and she believed in his vision more than anyone else. So when he struggled, she carried him. While Jacob worked tirelessly to launch his company, Emily worked twice as hard to support them both. She took extra shifts, covered rent, made sure he ate when he was too focused to remember. She gave everything, not because she had to, but because she thought she was building a future with him. She thought they were a team. At first, Jacob appreciated her sacrifices. He told her late at night that he couldn't do this without her. But as success came knocking, his words became fewer, his promises more distant. The late nights turned into all-nighters. The dinners she prepared sat cold on the table. Emily was no longer his partner. She was just someone in the background. She tried to remind him of what they had built together. But Jacob had changed. Money wasn't just a goal anymore. It was an obsession. He stopped seeing her as an equal and started seeing her as a weight holding him back. She told herself it was temporary, that he would wake up one day and remember what they had, but he never did. The day they broke up, there were no fireworks, no dramatic fights, just an emptiness that swallowed her whole. Jacob barely looked back, he told her, without saying the words, that he had already moved on to bigger things. And for the first time, Emily realized love alone wasn't enough. Sometimes the person you'd sacrifice everything for wouldn't do the same for you. But what Jacob didn't know, what he never even imagined, was that Emily hadn't just walked away with a broken heart. She had walked away with a secret that would change everything. Because while Jacob was chasing his empire, Emily had been given too little reasons to build her own world without him. Years later, when that wedding invitation arrived, Emily almost ignored it, almost. But she wasn't the same woman who had walked away years ago, and if Jacob thought she would stand in the background this time, he was about to learn just how much had changed. Jacob didn't even notice when Emily started slipping away. At first, it was just a few missed calls, a couple of unanswered texts. Then, it became entire nights without speaking, weeks where she felt more like a stranger than the woman who had sacrificed everything for him. He told himself it was temporary, that she would understand. But love doesn't survive on assumptions. Emily fought for them. She reminded him of who they were before success, of the late nights dreaming together, of the love that once felt unshakable. But Jacob was already gone, buried in his empire. His hunger for more consuming any trace of the man she had fallen in love with. His silence spoke louder than any words ever could. One evening she finally asked him, "Do I still matter to you?" Jacob hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough to confirm what she already knew, enough to break her heart in a way that no argument, no betrayal ever could. He didn't have to say it. His silence was the answer, and so she left. Jacob didn't chase after her. He told himself it was for the best, that love was a distraction, that she would only hold him back. He convinced himself that his future was too big for her small dreams. And for years he believed it, until the day he realized that no amount of success could fill the emptiness she left behind. But Emily didn't just leave with a broken heart. She left with a secret when she saw the 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test. Her hands trembled. Twins, Jacob's children, she could have told him. She could have begged him to stay, but why? The man he had become wouldn't care. He had made his choice, and so she made hers. She would raise them alone. Years passed, and she built a world for her sons. A world where they were loved, protected, enough. They didn't need Jacob's name, his wealth, or his approval. But fate has a cruel sense of humor, and just when she thought she had buried the past, an envelope arrived. Jacob Harrison was getting married, and he had invited her. Emily stared at the invitation for a long time. He had no idea what he had lost. He had no idea what was coming, and if he thought this wedding was going to be his victory, he was about to learn that karma always finds a way to even the score. Emily had spent years protecting her sons from the ghost of their father. Jacob had been a man who chose ambition over love, and she refused to let his absence define them. Ethan and Lucas didn't grow up with bedtime stories about their millionaire father. They grew up knowing that their mother was strong enough to give them everything they needed without him. But fate has a way of dragging the past back into the present. When Emily opened the wedding invitation, she almost laughed. The audacity, after all these years. Jacob thought she would simply attend his wedding like a forgotten ex. Like a spectator in the empire he built. He had no idea what he was about to walk into. She didn't need revenge. She had moved on, but something in her burned. Jacob thought he had closed that chapter, erased her from his life. He had spent years believing he had won, that he had left her behind while he climbed to the top. But the truth has a way of forcing itself into the light. At first, she considered ignoring the invitation, but then she looked at her sons. Jacob's sons. They were growing up without knowing who their father was, without knowing the other half of their story, and she realized something: Jacob might have walked away from her. But he didn't get to walk away from them, so she made a decision. If Jacob wanted her there, she would come. But she wouldn't come as a broken-hearted ex. She wouldn't come alone. She would come with the two little boys who carried his blood, his name, his sharp blue eyes, the truth that he had abandoned. The truth that would shatter his perfect world. The day of the wedding arrived, and Emily stood outside the grand venue, her hands holding onto her sons. They had no idea how much this moment would change their lives. Inside, Jacob was celebrating his perfect success story, unaware that the past was about to walk through the doors and rewrite the ending. With a deep breath, Emily stepped forward. The doors swung open, the whispers began. And in that moment, Jacob Harrison's carefully curated life collapsed in front of everyone. Jacob had everything planned. His wedding wasn't just about love, it was a statement. The guest list was elite, the venue luxurious. The event carefully curated to reflect his success, and inviting Emily, that was just the final touch. A way to remind her of what she lost, a way to prove, once and for all, that he had won. He pictured it perfectly. Emily walking into the grand ballroom, seeing him in his custom-tailored tuxedo, standing beside Victoria, the perfect bride. She would watch from the crowd, nothing more than a forgotten chapter in his success story. Maybe she'd feel regret. Maybe she'd wish she had stayed. Either way, Jacob would have the last laugh. Victoria never questioned why Emily was on the guest list. She trusted Jacob. Their relationship wasn't built on sentimentality. It was built on strategy. Together, they were unstoppable. They were a power couple. A wedding like this would solidify them as the ultimate business royalty. But what Jacob didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that Emily was no longer the woman he had once abandoned. She wasn't walking into that wedding as a lost ex. She was walking in as the mother of his two children, and this wasn't his story to control anymore. When the wedding day arrived, Jacob was ready to bask in his victory. He stood tall at the altar, surrounded by powerful men and beautiful women. Soaking in the admiration of his guests, the cameras flashed, the music played, the moment was set. Everything was perfect until the doors opened. At first, he barely reacted. Emily's presence wasn't a surprise. He had invited her after all. But then he saw them, two identical little boys walking beside her. Their faces unmistakably his, the color drained from his face, his pulse pounded, and in a single devastating second, his perfect world shattered. Gasps filled the room, whispers spread like wildfire. Victoria turned, confusion twisting into horror. Jacob had thought he was in full control of the narrative. But fate had other plans, and now in front of hundreds of people, he was about to face the one truth he had never been ready for. The wedding had been flawless. Until now, the second Emily stepped through the grand doors, whispers rippled through the room. But it wasn't just her presence that stole the air from the venue. It was the two little boys at her side. They stood tall, their identical blue eyes scanning the room. Oblivious to the chaos they had just unleashed, Jacob's stomach twisted. This wasn't possible. His mind scrambled for an explanation, for a reason, for denial. But the truth was staring right at him. Ethan and Lucas weren't just any children, they were his. The sharp jawline, the piercing eyes, the same intense expression. There was no mistaking it. Victoria's fingers dug into his arm. "Jacob, what is this?" Her voice was a mixture of confusion and anger, but Jacob couldn't answer. He couldn't breathe. The guests had stopped their polite conversations. The music had faded into silence. Every single person in that ballroom was watching, waiting. Emily's expression was unreadable. She didn't look smug, she didn't look angry. She looked prepared. She had expected this moment. Jacob, on the other hand, he had never imagined this. He had built an empire, a legacy, a carefully controlled life. And now, in front of everyone, that illusion was crumbling. His pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, to take control of the situation. But what could he say? The facts were undeniable. He hadn't just left Emily behind. He had abandoned his own children without even knowing it. And now the world knew too. Victoria took a slow step back. The woman who had always stood by his side, unwavering, now looked at him as if he were a stranger. Jacob could feel the judgment, the weight of a scandal that would never be erased. His wedding wasn't just ruined. His entire future had been rewritten in a single moment. For the first time in his life, Jacob Harrison wasn't the one in control. The man who had built an empire from nothing had just lost everything in front of everyone. And as his sons stared up at him, waiting for a reaction, Jacob realized one thing with chilling certainty. There was no escaping this. Jacob's world had just imploded, but the real explosion was about to begin. The silence in the room was suffocating. Hundreds of eyes bore into him, waiting for a reaction. But the only eyes that mattered, the two little boys standing beside Emily, held a truth he couldn't ignore. He had been blind to them for years now, the whole world could see. Victoria's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Jacob, say something." Her hands trembled, her perfect wedding slipping through her fingers, but Jacob couldn't form words. His mind raced, searching for control, for logic, for any explanation that could undo the disaster unfolding before him, but there was none. The damage was done. Emily didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't smirk. She just looked at him and said, "Meet your sons." The weight of those words hit like a punch to the gut. Jacob staggered slightly, his breathing uneven. His sons. How had this happened? How had he let something so important slip through his fingers without even knowing? He turned to Emily, voice low, raw. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question wasn't just for her, it was for himself. How had he gone so long believing he had everything, when in reality, he had lost the most important thing of all? Emily's expression hardened. Would it have made a difference? She already knew the answer, so did he. Victoria let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Unbelievable. Her voice was laced with fury and humiliation. She had spent years building a future with a man who had just proven he was still a stranger to her. She had defended him, trusted him, and now she had become nothing more than a footnote in his biggest scandal. The guests whispered, the tension growing heavier. But for the first time, Jacob wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about the two little boys standing in front of him. They weren't an abstract idea anymore. They weren't just a mistake or a consequence. They were his children. And for the first time in years, Jacob Harrison was truly afraid. His entire life had been built on control, on power, on calculated moves. But this wasn't business. This wasn't strategy. This was fatherhood. And for the first time, Jacob wasn't sure if he had what it took to win. The whispers turned into outright murmurs, a wave of shock rippling through the venue. Some guests tried to be discreet, others didn't bother. This was the kind of scandal they lived for, a millionaire groom exposed at the altar, a hidden past unraveling in real time. It was more than a wedding, it was a spectacle. Victoria's breathing was uneven, her hands clenched into fists. "I won't be humiliated like this," she spat, her voice sharp with rage. The perfect life she had planned, the future she had built with Jacob. It was all crashing down, and the worst part, she hadn't seen it coming. Jacob finally moved, reaching for her hand, but Victoria stepped back. "Don't." Her eyes burned with betrayal. She wasn't just furious about the twins. She was furious that Jacob had let her walk into this wedding completely blind, that he had let her believe she knew him, when clearly she didn't. The guests weren't even pretending to be polite anymore. A few discreetly pulled out their phones. Someone whispered loudly, "His ex just walked in with his secret kids. This is unreal." The story was already escaping the ballroom, spreading like wildfire through every powerful circle that Jacob once controlled. Emily stood firm, unfazed by the chaos around her. She hadn't come here to destroy Jacob's wedding, but she also hadn't come to let him continue his lie. The truth was out now, and there was no taking it back. Jacob had to face it. No more running, no more pretending. Victoria let out a cold, bitter laugh. You deserve this, Jacob, every second of it. With that, she turned on her heels and stormed out, leaving behind a stunned crowd and a groom who had just lost everything he thought mattered: the perfect bride, the perfect wedding, the perfect life. Gone in an instant. Jacob barely registered her leaving. The man who had spent years chasing success, fortune, power, stood frozen, staring at the only thing that truly mattered: two little boys who had just stepped into his world. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do next. Jacob had built his entire life around winning. Every decision, every sacrifice, every calculated move had been made to ensure he came out on top. But now, standing in the ruins of his perfect wedding, with Victoria gone and the whispers of scandal filling the room, he realized something terrifying. For the first time, he had truly lost. Emily watched him carefully, expecting him to do what he always did: run. But Jacob didn't move. He barely even blinked. His mind was racing, not with excuses, not with damage control, but with a single, undeniable fact. He was a father, and he had missed everything. Slowly, he turned back to the two little boys, still standing at Emily's side. They weren't looking at him with anger or blame. They were just waiting to see what kind of man he really was. And for the first time in his life, Jacob wasn't sure if he had the answer. He took a cautious step forward, his voice unsteady. Ethan, Lucas. The names felt foreign on his tongue, yet somehow familiar, like something that had been missing all along. The boys exchanged a look before Ethan finally spoke. "Are you really our dad?" The words hit him harder than any business deal ever had. Emily's arms were crossed, her expression unreadable. She had spent years convincing herself that Jacob was incapable of change, that if he ever found out, he would treat fatherhood like a business transaction, cold, calculated, distant. But the man standing before her now, he looked lost. He looked human. Jacob exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice raw, "but I want to try." He wasn't asking for instant forgiveness. He wasn't expecting a second chance overnight. But for the first time, Jacob Harrison, the man who had spent his life chasing power, was chasing something real. The weight of the moment settled between them. The cameras, the guests, the scandal. It all faded into the background. Jacob had spent years trying to prove to the world that he was unstoppable. But now, he had to prove to two little boys that he was worth believing in. Jacob had spent his life chasing numbers, power, and influence, believing that success meant never looking back. But standing there, facing the reality of his two sons, he realized that none of it mattered if he had no one to share it with. For the first time, wealth felt meaningless compared to what he had lost. Rebuilding wouldn't be easy. Emily wasn't going to let him walk into their children's lives just because he suddenly decided to care. Trust wasn't something he could buy. It had to be earned, and so for the first time, Jacob Harrison did what he had never done before. He showed up at first. Ethan and Lucas barely spoke to him. They watched him cautiously, unsure if he was temporary, just another fleeting presence in their lives. But Jacob didn't run. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he learned their favorite foods, their bedtime routines, the little details that truly mattered. The world still talked about the wedding disaster. The media feasted on his downfall, branding him a cautionary tale of misplaced ambition. But Jacob didn't care. Let them talk. He had spent his entire life crafting an image. Now, he was crafting something real. Fatherhood wasn't a press release, it was action. Victoria had moved on, and so had his business partners. The scandal was yesterday's news, but for Jacob, this was just the beginning. He had failed at love before, failed at family, failed at seeing what truly mattered. But failure wasn't the end. It was a lesson, and this time he was listening. One afternoon, As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan and Lucas ran toward him, their laughter filling the air. "Dad!" The word was still new, still uncertain, but it was there. Jacob knelt, catching them both in his arms, feeling something he had never felt before. This wasn't a win or a loss. This was life. Emily watched from a distance, arms crossed, a small smile on her lips. Jacob Harrison had been many things: a ruthless businessman, a man obsessed with control. But now he was a father, and for the first time, that was the only title that truly mattered. Life has a way of delivering karma when you least expect it. Jacob Harrison thought he had it all: wealth, power, control. But none of it mattered when he came face to face with the truth he had been running from. The real question isn't what he did next. It's what you would do in his place. Would you chase success at any cost, or would you realize before it's too late? What truly matters: how many people sacrifice love, family, and real connections for status and power, only to realize too late that they were chasing the wrong kind of success. Maybe you're at a crossroads right now. Maybe you're too focused on proving something to the world instead of asking yourself, what do I actually want? What really matters? Jacob got a second chance, but not everyone does. What about you? Are you making choices today that you'll regret tomorrow? Are you neglecting the people who truly care about you? Because in the end, money and power can be lost overnight, but the people who stand by you, that's what lasts. So ask yourself, are you running toward the right future, or are you running away from it? If this story taught you something, leave a comment below. I want to hear what you think, and if you don't want to miss more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You never know which story will change the way you see everything.